Aloha and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the sixth and final session of the US-Singapore Cyber&Tech Security Virtual Series toward shared ethical standards in AI, American and Singaporean perspectives, held with the support from the US Embassy Singapore. My name is Crystal Pryor, and I'm Director of Nonproliferation, Technology, and Fellowships at the Pacific Forum. I'd like to begin today by providing an overview of the US-Singapore Cyber&Tech Security Virtual Series. The rapid growth in digital innovations, such as 5G technology, IoT devices, and artificial intelligence, and the divergence of state strategic interests over cyberspace and data governance, are giving rise to new technical vulnerabilities and geopolitical uncertainties. These vulnerabilities and uncertainties impact international relations and our daily lives. The scale and cross-border nature of these challenges means that international cooperation has become essential. The US and Singapore have been working together on a number of different issues, such as strengthening collaboration in the digital economy and cybersecurity, developing artificial intelligence tools for humanitarian aid and disaster relief, and working on issues of shared military relevance. Through the US-Singapore Cyber&Tech Security Virtual Series, a mix of 6 open and closed-door sessions with panels of experts and participants spanning 2 US administrations, Pacific Forum has identified, examined, and discussed some of the most pressing issues related to cyberspace and technology, aiming to improve existing cooperation between the US and Singapore to face the increasingly complex legal, ethical, and security challenges that lie ahead of us. The first session examined the latest trends in cyber threats in the Indo-Pacific region and the role played by the US and Singapore in enhancing regional cybersecurity. The second session explored the application of international law to cyberspace, potential opportunities and challenges of US-ASEAN and US-Singapore cybersecurity cooperation in supporting cyber norm making, and capacity building and confidence building measures within relevant regional institutions. The third closed-door session examined the opportunities and challenges that underpin the use of big data in an ever increasingly interconnected yet vulnerable cyber domain, and how these have been amplified since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. The fourth, also closed-door session, dissected the US and Singapore's efforts in enhancing the security of critical national infrastructure in the midst of the global pandemic. It also discussed the different mechanisms that the 2 countries have established to improve their coordination in cyber incident response and sharing best practices to protect CNI. The fifth session examined the role of the US and Singapore to identify opportunities and navigate challenges in data governance and enhance trust in the region. If you missed any of our sessions, you can find links to the event page with the key findings and video recordings for the public events in the chat box now. In today's final session, we'll be seeking to discuss and perhaps establish shared ethical standards in AI. In 2019, the US and Singapore publicly expressed their interest to deepen bilateral cooperation on artificial intelligence. While the announcement made clear that both countries intend to strengthen bilateral strategic AI cooperation, there's also the potential to advance ethical principles and standards in developing other kinds of AI-enabled applications. Artificial intelligence touches on every aspect of our lives and far exceeds the cognitive capabilities of human beings. It can increase the pace and impact of innovation, but also heightens the risk of negative and unintended side effects. AI-powered technologies have raised fundamental ethical questions about the significant impact they'll have on issues such as privacy, manipulation, opacity, bias, human-robot interaction, employment, etc. To mitigate adverse effects, policymakers and industry leaders must forge widely accepted ethical standards in the development and deployment of AI technologies. Challenges include avoiding unintended bias, educating consumers on the conscientious use of AI, and enforcing AI strategies and policy compliance. This session will explore how both countries can share best practices and lessons learned in their respective efforts in setting the rules of the road on AI governance to foster public trust. The speakers will reflect on how both countries can take a human-centric approach to build an AI ecosystem that promotes inclusivity, transparency, and accountability. Please note that remarks made in today's program are on the record, and a video audio recording of this session, in addition to key findings, will be made available on the Pacific Forum website and social media in the future. The discussion, which will include feedback and Q&A with the audience, will be moderated by Mark Manantan, resident Lloyd and Lillian Vasey Fellow at Pacific Forum. Participants will be allowed to unmute their mics to ask questions or offer feedback later, but cameras are disabled throughout the session. We'll also have interactive features like polling as we go along. Here is the first poll for today. So the question is, which factors hinder Southeast Asia's advancement in AI? And you can choose more than one, but the options are uneven funding for research and development, differing priorities on the digital economy, diverging approaches to data governance, or lack or absence of AI talent. While we're waiting on those poll results, I'll note that we have a survey we would like you to complete after the event concludes. Please find the link to the survey in the chat box now. Okay, just waiting for a couple more votes to roll in. Okay, let me share the results. So by a slim margin, uneven funding for R&D got the top response, followed sort of in order by differing priorities on digital economy, diverging approaches to data governance, and lack or absence of AI talent. Okay, we'll close those results. Now to today's session. We'll do the 3 presentations together, followed by Q&A and discussion. This is a friendly reminder to speakers to keep your presentations to 10 to 12 minutes max, so we can have ample time for questions and discussion. This session is 90 minutes total. Note that participants, you may raise your hand or submit questions in the Q&A box as you have them during the presentations. In other words, you don't have to save all of them until the end. Today's presenters for the session towards shared ethical standards in AI, American and Singaporean perspectives, are Dr. Jacqueline Kerr, Senior Research Fellow for Defense and Technology Futures at the Institute for National Strategic Studies at National Defense University, Dr. Simon Chesterman, Dean, National University of Singapore Law, and Senior Director of AI Governance, AI Singapore, and Ms. Teo Yi Ling, Senior Fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, or RSIS. First up, we have Dr. Jacqueline Kerr. She is a Senior Research Fellow for Defense and Technology Futures at the Center for Strategic Research at National Defense University and an affiliate with the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University. She's also a non-resident fellow with Brookings Foreign Policy Program, where she's affiliated with the Center for Security, Strategy, and Technology and the Artificial Intelligence and Emerging Technology Initiative. Her research and policy advising focus on digital and emerging technologies and their current and future impacts on international politics, national security, and democracy. Dr. Kerr, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Crystal. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to start just by thanking you all at Pacific Forum for the invitation to be part of this interesting discussion and a valuable discussion, and also by saying that everything I express here today are my own views. They're not the views of the US government, the DoD, or the National Defense University, or Brookings Institution, where I'm affiliated. That being said, I'll discuss 4 areas with you briefly as a sort of start to our discussion. First, the Singapore-US partnership. Why is AI important? Second, why is AI ethics in particular so vital? Third, what are examples, the kind of ethical concerns we're talking about when we talk about AI ethics, and why are these important? Fourth, What are some current efforts to address AI ethics by different actors and their implications? And I'll focus there a little bit on the US DoD perspective and their approach with the new ethical principles for AI that they've adopted. Okay, so to start out, the Singapore-US partnership, why is AI so important? Well, US and Singapore share a valuable strategic partnership. The United States is a key supplier of defense technologies to Singapore, and it also provides facilities for military training. Singapore, on the other hand, is a vital regional partner to the US and helps in numerous cross-sector security issues, from counterterrorism to maritime issues and the like. Singapore also hosts the US Navy unit that coordinates regional operations. So both play really important roles, and the partnership is important. AI, why is it important? Why? Well, AI and other data-centric digital emerging technologies are becoming even more central to national security and to national economies overall. And they will be important to any strategic partnership in the near future. And so why AI in particular? It's one of the fourth industrial revolution technologies. These are all technologies that are vital in various ways, that are data-centric, that are in many cases easy to use, have a small footprint. A critical aspect of them is that they're dual use, but not just dual use, they're multi-use. They have many different potential, both civilian and military applications, cut across all areas of the economy and civilian life. In some cases, there are deep interdependencies across these areas, and these uses of these dual use technologies and of AI in particular. And these can foster interdependencies both across sectors and also across countries. As today's emerging technologies are so data centric, furthermore, AI in particular, AI and machine learning are the technologies that allow this data to be most fruitfully used for learning and further system development. So they have powerful multiplier effects on both the pace and the impact of developments across numerous industries and areas of political and social life, as well as military capabilities. So all aspects of strategic partnership, economic partnership, social partnership, and so on. The US and Singapore are indeed now working, as you've heard, on further developing bilateral cooperation on AI. Since at least June 2019, they've been taking steps in this area, and this will be important to the continuation of the partnership and cooperation. Cooperation between the US and Singapore on AI will be particularly critical given Singapore's role as a strong regional partner and the ongoing and increasing competition between the US and China in relation to digital technologies and AI specifically, and also Singapore's technological capacity and capability, which makes it a valuable partner in this. In this light, an area of particular importance will be the discussion of AI ethics and ensuring what's been called interoperability, not just around the technology itself, but the values that it supports. So why are AI ethics so vital? Well, in part, this is because of many uses of the technology that are cross-cutting, dual use, multi-use, and what I was talking about before, the fact that it can be used in many different civilian and military sectors. So you have everything from smart cities and IoT, sensor tech being applied for energy efficiency or law enforcement, to medical diagnostic tools, agriculture, self-driving cars, education applications. And on the military side, you have uses, for example, of facial recognition or object identification capabilities for everything from CCTV and surveillance technologies for counterterrorism security to drone strikes. You have defensive and offensive cyber capabilities that are becoming more and more AI dependent. So because the technology itself and the systems it's embedded in are often highly complex and opaque, AI generates possibilities for unanticipated effects in both military and civilian applications, as well as possible interactions between these. And that's all the more so because of all the different sectors it touches. These eventualities sometimes necessitate new discussions about value trade-offs, norms, best practices to facilitate gleaning maximum benefits from the new technologies, while also mitigating risks and averting worst-case repercussions. So what are some examples of the kinds of concerns we're talking about with AI and ethics? Well, for example, I'll go through some of the ones that Crystal laid out. Employment. Automation has the potential as a second order effect of AI-based automation to lead to massive unemployment if not dealt with ahead of time. This could have major social repercussions. Bias and equity. Predictive policing, for example, which is data-based, so why wouldn't it be good, has the potential to create pernicious positive feedback loops, targeting particular communities. Facial recognition has the potential to be using data sets that were based on particular demographics, like all white male study participants, for example. And then that in turn can lead to algorithms that don't work well with certain demographics and with repercussions that come from that socially and politically. Opacity and unexplainability of AI algorithms. Black boxes are great for some things, but they're not great for other things. They can be problematic for legal, social, or safety reasons in certain contexts. For example, where provability and the elimination of doubt in a decision is key. For example, like criminal convictions, self-driving cars, avoiding accidents. It can be, another issue is that AI can be weaponized and subject to manipulation. And if we trust it too much and don't anticipate those potential consequences, that can be problematic. Data poisoning and adversarial AI are becoming more and more significant potential factors to consider. And these have potential roles both in civilian and military sectors. Things like deep fakes can be seen as one example of use of AI in an adversarial context against whole of society, or synthetic text used to drive disinformation campaigns. And while we haven't seen that much of this yet, it's many people would say a matter of time. Privacy considerations are obviously a huge one. If data is the new fuel, where does that data come from? Well, in some cases it comes from user data. As more and more tech depend on user data as their lifeblood, this raises alarms for individual privacy and autonomy. Targeted recommendation algorithms, for example, have potential repercussions for society, or targeted disinformation campaigns using some of the same algorithms. We've heard discussion of surveillance capitalism and its implications. And this really raises questions about how far do we want to go in terms of what data is collected, what's acceptable, and where are their limits? Is it used to support further development of digital authoritarianism, for example, or military capabilities that we don't want to see adopted? Another issue is human AI interaction, or human robot interaction, whether military or medical decision making. What happens when a human decision maker is either supplemented or replaced by an algorithm? Are there risks of loss of autonomy of decision making judgment, or edge cases where they're underrepresented in the data, leading to misclassifications? These could lead to inadvertent escalation risks and war, or they could lead to violations of the laws of armed combat. Another area, or actually moving on from those, so what are some of the efforts to address AI ethics that are underway? Well, we've seen a lot of calls in recent years from the private sector industry leaders, from civil society and academia and think tanks and consortiums from governments and intergovernmental bodies, and some efforts underway to lay out clear understandings of what the value trade-offs are and what the ethical guidelines should be. We've seen this in the OECD. We've seen some efforts at collaboration on AI in the global, in the GPI initiative started by Canada and France. We've seen also many efforts by national governments. The US government in particular has taken a number of efforts underway across the interagency and in Congress. You've had ongoing effort in the State Department, at the whole of government level, in the NSC, NIST, USAID, and other agencies. But I'll emphasize in conclusion here the role of the DoD and what it has undertaken. In addition to the efforts to provide guidelines on next steps with AI by the National Security Commission on AI. There also has been a process underway in the DoD internally. The Defense Science Board spent 15 months consulting with leading AI experts and coming up with a list, give ample time for public feedback from experts in different stakeholder communities that led to the adoption by the DoD last February in 2020 of the ethical principles for AI. These aim to address areas of ambiguity and challenges not settled by existing law and norms, either domestic or international. And they apply in both combat and non-combat functions. So to go over those briefly, the 5 principles are responsible use. So DoD personnel will exercise appropriate levels of judgment and care, and so on. And I can go into more detail on these. I'll just very quickly, because I see I'm at the end of the time. But equitable use. The department will take deliberate steps to minimize unintended bias in AI capabilities. Traceability. The department's AI capabilities will be developed and deployed such that relevant personnel possess an appropriate understanding of technology, development process, operational methods, and so on. Reliable use. The department's AI capabilities will be explicit, well-defined uses, and the safety, security, and effectiveness of such capabilities will be subject to testing and assurance. Governability. The department will design and engineer AI capabilities to fulfill their intended functions while possessing the ability to detect and avoid unintended consequences and the ability to disengage or deactivate deployed systems that demonstrate unintended behavior. So you can see how these are responsive to some of the issues I highlighted in the beginning. And I think I'll just end by saying that there is ongoing work in the DoD to clearly highlight how these principles apply in real life, how they can be operationalized. And in public comments last month, Alka Patel, the JAIC's lead on adoption of the ethical AI strategy, explained that critical areas now include cultural interoperability, which is what I mentioned at the beginning, so that we have a mutual understanding not just about the technologies, but what the ethical guidelines are. And this includes things like acquisition and supply chains and the values embedded in technologies we acquire from industry partners, and also our partnerships with other states. And critical to all of these will be building trust. So I think that this is an event that contributes to that, and it's a pleasure to be here, and I'll hand it off to the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kerr, for an excellent overview of some of the real and anticipated issues with AI, and also to describe a bit about the US and specifically Department of Defense strategy on this. Next up, we have Professor Simon Chesterman, who is Dean and Provost Chair, Professor of the National University of Singapore Faculty of Law, and Senior Director of AI Governance at AI Singapore. He is also editor of the Asian Journal of International Law and co-president of the Law School's Global League. Professor Chesterman is the author or editor of 21 books, including We, the Robots, Regulating Artificial Intelligence and the Limits of Law by Cambridge University Press this year, Law and Practice of, next month, okay, forthcoming. Law and Practice of the United Nations with Ian Johnstone and David Malone, Oxford University Press, 2016. One Nation Under Surveillance, Oxford at 2011. You the People, also Oxford 2004, and Just War or Just Peace, Oxford 2001. He is a recognized authority on international law whose work has opened up new areas of research on conceptions of public authority, including the rules and institutions of global governance, state building and post-conflict reconstruction, the changing role of intelligence agencies, and the emerging role of artificial intelligence and big data. Professor Chesterman, you have the floor.
I think most of my time's now gone, I assume, but thank you very much for that extremely generous introduction. And it's a great pleasure to be with you, Crystal, Jacqueline, to see Yiling again. We're in the same country, but haven't caught up in person for a while. But I'm particularly interested to get into the Q&A later on, and I'm delighted to see we've already got 3 really interesting questions coming in on cutting edge issues like how we how we address a problem like the regulation of AI when the standards across countries and across companies will be very different, how and when we can regulate things like lethal autonomous weapons, which there's a UN report that came out recently that suggests that the time to regulate lethal autonomous weapons was last year, because that's when a truly autonomous weapon appears to have been deployed for the first time in combat in Libya. But I'm very much going to follow on from Jacqueline's presentation. Jacqueline, I think, really helpfully mapped out some of the strategic questions for the US and Singapore, and she wound up on this sort of question of ethical principles. And that's really my departure point. So as part of a larger project, I've been looking at the regulation of AI. And so what I'll do in this brief presentation is map out sort of what is the problem we're trying to solve at a very general level, not limited to military uses, but military civilian. So what's the problem? How have we addressed it up until now? And where might we be going in the future? So rather than you all trying to work out what that pile of books behind me is, I'm going to share just a few slides to help organize these thoughts. So the starting point is, what is the problem? And it's quite common for new technologies to be the subject of fear or even of concern on the part of people. What's unusual about AI, I think, is that AI, it's not neo-Luddites that are worried about it. It's often the people who best understand the technology are also sounding the most dire warnings. So we've had Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Stephen Hawking express in very graphic terms concerns about what AI could do if it gets out of control, if it goes beyond our capacity to control it. Elon Musk going so far as to invest $10 million in an effort to establish principles to ensure that AI remains, if you like, friendly. So what are we talking about? I assume this audience doesn't need an introduction, but basically AI, I'm using it to mean computers, technology that exercises functions that would normally be cognitively performed by a human at a level. We're normally talking about narrow AI, although some of the concerns that Elon Musk, Bill Gates, and others have raised concern general AI. Machine learning, the ability of computers to improve performance without necessarily being instructed on how to do so. Robotics, how these entities, how these machines engage with the world. If you combine AI and machine learning, you get things like the AlphaGo Zero that defeated Lee Sedol in Go. Combine artificial intelligence and robotics, you get things like autopilot. Combine robotics and machine learning, you get the humble Roomba. So all of this, I assume, is pretty common knowledge. So what are the actual challenges? So I'm approaching this from a legal perspective. And so I would distinguish between the sort of how do we make sure that AI is doing nice things, that it's sustainable, that it's doing desirable, that it's even equitable, and focus more on how do we get the benefits of AI while mitigating or minimizing harms. And that's usually what the purpose of regulation is. And I'll talk a bit about regulation at the very end. But what are the challenges that AI poses? And basically it falls, I think, into three broad categories: speed, autonomy, and opacity. So the first, speed, is just that AI, modern computer technology, can do things faster, and that poses regulatory challenges. And just an illustration of this from more than a decade ago is the flash crash of 2010, when $1 trillion was wiped off the New York Stock Exchange within 30 minutes. No one knew why. And in 15 minutes, more than half of it came back. And again, no one knew why. And basically it was linked with high-frequency trading algorithms. And so these high-frequency trading algorithms pose a regulatory challenge because they're doing things that would be perfectly lawful and indeed perfectly normal if humans were doing them, but at a speed that makes it very hard to regulate. Similarly, in competition law, if two people get together and agree on price manipulation, that might be a violation of competition or antitrust law. But when two algorithms do it instantaneously, there might be no element of collusive intent, which means there's a regulatory gap. So the reason this is a concern is you get harms that the law is intended to prevent, but the law does not operate at a speed that enables it to address it at future. So that's one type of problem, speed. The second obvious one is autonomy, and Jacqueline's talked about this. I won't go into it in detail, but this is the problem that if you can't blame a human or a corporation for something, then who can you blame? So for example, this often comes up in autonomous vehicles. If the driver is not in control, then who can we blame if the car crashes into you? Actually, this isn't such a problem. There's already legal regimes that if I crash my car into Crystal because I'm driving carelessly, she can blame me. But if I injure her because the car blows up next to her, she might not be able to sue me, but she can sue the manufacturer. And a lot of these situations will see liability move from the user to the manufacturer or possibly the owner. But autonomy does occasionally pose a bit of a challenge to our regulatory systems. The third is opacity, and Jacqueline highlighted this. And I think quite rightly highlighted that often opacity is not such a problem. There are all sorts of aspects of life where we don't really care if we understand the details of how something works. Most of us are happy to get on an aeroplane without understanding the laws of aerodynamics. Most of us are happy to take medicine, even if at a molecular level, even the doctors don't understand how certain pharmaceuticals work. But also most of us would be outraged if a judge determined that we were guilty and the reason that was given was a statistical answer rather than a reasoned, individualized answer. So opacity in some situations is a problem. So that's the problem we're trying to solve. How do we then, secondly, go about trying to solve it? Well, for about 7 decades, we got not much further than this guy, Isaac Asimov, who in 1942 introduced the 3 laws of robotics. So I won't go through this, but I assume many of you have read Asimov's stories. The only thing you really need to say about his laws of robotics are, if they'd worked, his literary career would have been brief. Because if they'd worked, if they'd avoided the problems, then most of his stories wouldn't have made much sense or wouldn't have been interesting. When in fact, in the very first story, when the laws are introduced, a robot is in paralysis because of a conflict between the second and the third law, and it's only by a human throwing himself in harm's way to invoke the first that the story progresses. So for about 7 decades, though, we didn't really get much further than that. Then something changes around 2016. Through the 2000s, there was the start of a discussion about ethics and AI and robotics, but it was really around 2018 that there was an explosion. And the reason is that between 2016 and 2018, and this also echoes something Jacqueline was talking about, we had Cambridge Analytica, we had Facebook, we had the realization that AI, or at least the sort of modern technology, modern social media economy, wouldn't just affect individuals, it could affect countries, it could distort elections. And so the Cambridge Analytica scandal really broke in the first half of 2018, and that's the same period within which Google, Microsoft, IBM all released their ethical principles. And you can see the number of countries that were releasing their principles around this time. So what do all of these mean? What are the current principles? Well, they also echo the DoD principles that Jacqueline walked through. Sorry, that's Singapore. So basically, if you go through hundreds of these documents, you end up with around 6, sometimes it goes up to 8 principles. And it's pretty hard to disagree with them. Human control, transparency, safety, accountability, non-discrimination, privacy. I think most of these map onto the ideas that Jacqueline highlighted from the DoD. The question I want to ask is whether any of them are really necessary. Because when you say an ethical principle of safety, well, we should already have product liability. Accountability, or in the DoD's language, responsibility, that just means you should comply with the law. Non-discrimination, again, you should just comply with the law. In this case, human rights law. Privacy, again, you should comply with the law. So a lot of these ethical principles really are just elaborate ways of saying that you shouldn't be able to do something through AI that you can't do normally, that AI should be accountable to the law like everyone else. The 2 areas in which I think there is a gap that does need to be addressed are these issues of human control and transparency, or in the language of Singapore's model AI governance framework, human centricity and transparency or explainability. So these are 2 areas where if we want AI to be truly accountable, you need to ensure that it can be traced back to an individual or a company so that there is a person you can hold to account. And that transparency enables you to understand how a decision was made to a sufficient degree that you can hold that person or entity accountable. And that needs to be more than just the European Union right to an explanation. It needs to be system level explanation. And we can talk about that in discussion if people are interested. So on this question, so should we or should we not regulate, or how would we go about regulating? Well, the reason why we regulate is generally to address market failures. So you don't want people being harmed, for example, by autonomous vehicles unnecessarily, or if they are harmed, you want someone to be held accountable. But we also want to support social and other policies. Again, as Jacqueline said, even if, for example, an AI system could produce optimal outcomes in a biased fashion by engaging in discrimination, we would still say, even if that's efficient, we don't want to allow it because we don't like bias. But the danger is the danger of constraining innovation and losing one's competitive advantage. And that's why many countries, Singapore included, so Singapore explicitly made a decision 2 years ago not to regulate artificial intelligence. China's national strategic policy aims for regulation of AI by 2025. And the US doesn't even have a federal level data protection law, let alone a formal regulation of AI. So many countries are wary about this. And we've seen a different approach. The US with a kind of market-led approach, the European Union, which has gone further than most. And my last slide is just an indication of their draft regulation. So the Europeans approaching this through a human rights lens, and China, where even this month or last month's cybersecurity laws and data security laws focus very much on data localization. So when do you regulate? So regulation poses a real challenge because this is the Collingwood dilemma. At an early stage, when you could regulate, you don't necessarily know what the problems are. But a late stage, when you understand the problems, the costs of regulation have gone up significantly. And we can see that, for example, with social media. Back in 2004, if you'd foreseen the kind of problems we've seen with social media, perhaps you could have tried to regulate it, but we couldn't foresee them at the time. Now, jump forward to 2021, that ship has sailed and it's very hard to put the toothpaste back in the bottle. And so many countries have either adopted a kind of masterly inactivity, that is the idea that you try and set up sandboxes, you regulate in a very hands-off way, or you try and contain the potential dangers, but they've been very wary of constraining innovation because that might just lead things going elsewhere. So I'll leave this to discussion, but I think there's a distinction to be made between managing some risks, preventing some others, and one of the Q&A questions highlights lethal autonomous weapons. I think that's maybe where we should draw a red line. And process legitimacy, here I'm really talking about governments. If a government shouldn't be allowed to outsource certain functions to a corporation or another entity, it shouldn't be allowed to outsource it to an AI system either. So this is the EU's approach. We could talk about their regulation. This is my book. If you're very enthusiastic, you can go and buy it online. But I'm looking forward to a rich discussion to come, and apologies for going about a minute over time. Thanks very much.
That's excellent. Thank you. And we'll definitely be getting a copy of your book. Thank you for your comprehensive presentation on AI regulation and ethical principles, inclusive of a Singaporean perspective. Our final speaker is Ms. Tiao Yi Ling. She is a senior fellow with the Center of Excellence for National Security, or CENS, at RSIS. She's part of the Cyber and Homeland Defense program of CENS, engaged with exploring policy, legal, and regulatory issues around the cyber domain, including international cyber norms, threats and conflict, crime and law enforcement technologies, and smart city issues, strategic communications and disinformation, and national security issues in disruptive technology. A qualified barrister at law in England and Wales, and an advocate and solicitor in Singapore, Yi Ling has practice experience with international and local law firms in the areas of intellectual property, technology, media and entertainment, and commercial law. She's the author of Media Law in Singapore, published by Sweden Maxwell, a pioneering and definitive text examining the development of media and communication-related laws in Singapore, alongside the practical management of media issues. Ms. Teo, if you would.
Thank you very much, Crystal, and thank you to the Pacific Forum for inviting me to speak on this panel. And it's listening to Jacqueline and to Simon. As third speaker, I certainly stand on the shoulders of giants. You have just paved the way for me to kind of like segue into what we are doing here in Singapore in terms of AI governance. As Simon referred to the work of Isaac Asimov, like a godfather of science fiction, I will actually open my presentation with what I would term proto-science fiction, with a little tale from a Jewish Hasidic law. There's a story of a golem. A golem is an artificial creature animated by secret magical incantations. And this golem was created by a rabbi in 16th century Prague. The golem was created for carrying out specific tasks. And among these was protecting Jews from attacks by those who hated them. Now, all went very well as long as the rabbi correctly ensured the proper functioning of the golem. But a day came when he omitted to do so, and the golem ran amok, causing damage and threatening life. So the rabbi was then forced to render the golem lifeless. And if this story is to have any legs to be believed, it still exists in an attic somewhere in the city of Prague. So a cautionary tale, but a lot to kind of like take away from it. So I won't go over what Jacqueline and Simon have already alluded to in terms of what AI is, why we need to regulate it, the challenges, the urgency, the arising of many forums of principles of discussion of principles. But I want to start here with this discussion in terms of why AI is in our lives and why we allow it in our lives. And the basis of that is is the Latin notion primum non nocere, first do no harm. And if we're going to let AI in our lives, and it's pretty much in our lives already, it has to be guided by the welfare of humans in mind. We've listed a number of principles: justice, equality, safety, accountability, privacy, transparency. This is what it must reflect. Secondly, AI must enhance our existence rather than replace it. It must serve our needs. It must not be more powerful than us. Thirdly, AI's range and depth of perception must become sympathetic with ours for it to be meaningfully and sensitively harnessed in certain contexts. And the two things that come to mind are image recognition, facial recognition, and the administration of criminal justice. So over the last 2 years, governments and international organizations have been issuing principles, frameworks on AI ethics and governance, and Singapore is no exception. So in January 2019, we launched our Model AI Governance Framework at the World Economic Forum in Davos. And the second edition was released just last year. So our framework's USP, it's the unique selling point, is that it translates ethical principles into practical recommendations that organizations could adopt in implementing AI in a responsible manner. So the second edition incorporates the feedback gleaned from Singapore's participation in international platforms convened around AI matters, such as the European Commission's high-level expert group and the OECD expert group on AI. So what it contains as well is experiences of organizations that have adopted AI as case study examples. So the framework is actually, it's built around 4 key areas concerning the responsible use of AI. Internal governance structures and measures, how an organization can adapt existing policies or set up internal governance structures to incorporate the values to risk management systems and its attendant responsibilities relating to algorithmic decision making. It's the second pillar is determining the level of human involvement in AI augmented decision making. And the model framework actually it proposes a matrix to help organizations determine the level of human involvement required in AI augmented decision making. And it's built along 2 axes: probability and severity of harm to an individual or to an organization. So applying the matrix is a way of figuring out the degree of human involvement, whether it takes the form of human in the loop, over the loop, or out of the loop. Where in the loop is involved and active, then over loop is supervisory generally, and out of loop is really no hands off, no human involvement at all. So the third pillar is operations management. So it's issues to be considered when you are developing, when you're selecting and maintaining AI models, including data management. So those are workflow concerns. And finally, and very important as well, is stakeholder interaction and communication. So how you should be as an organization communicating with your stakeholders, your clients, your customers, about how you are using AI in your organization. And this is really about building and maintaining trust and openness. So a little bit about the framework in terms of what it is. It is algorithm agnostic. It does not focus on a specific AI or data analytics methodology. It applies to the use of and deployment of AI in general. It is technology agnostic. It is sector agnostic. It is really a baseline set of considerations and measures for organizations operating in any sector to adopt. and it is scale and business model agnostic. It does not discriminate as regards an organization's scale or size. So it doesn't propose a new set of principles. We're not reinventing the wheel here. It draws on existing and common AI ethical principles and converts them into implementable practices. It also recognizes that there are already a number of attempts globally in establishing a universal set of principles. And as these are emerging, a core set of principles are emerging, there are attendant nuances across cultures, jurisdictions, and industries. And this is very, very key in any collaboration discussion. Understanding what these nuances are and the contextual perspectives of such principles. So there are 12 principles that the model framework has annexed to it, and broadly, accountability, accuracy, auditability, explainability, fairness, human centricity and well-being, human rights alignment, inclusivity, progressiveness, responsibility, accountability, and transparency in terms of systems and applications and algorithms, robustness and security, and sustainability. So I'm not going to go into each of them. They're actually elaborated on. So what I find nice here is that the framework actually in listing these principles actually explains what they are in the context. And so there's actually a bit of a contextual understanding of this. So right now, adoption of our governance framework is on a voluntary basis. Our AI ecosystem and all the activities comprised in it, from the development of AI solutions to businesses leveraging AI solutions, is hard to regulate. Unlike the advertising or media industries, for example, in these industries where many competitors undertaking similar business activities, there are often codes of ethics that industry players agree to be governed and held accountable by. It may be very hard to prescribe at this point in time a common code of ethics that all entities engaged in AI activity must subscribe to. The AI industry in Singapore is nascent, and the government is wary of regulating too much too soon for fear of chilling innovation. So the framework is very much trying to find a middle way, I believe, in encouraging and supporting responsible AI development and deployment. At this point, I want to kind of reach towards two German concepts. The concepts of Ordnung and Bildung. And Ordnung is about orderliness in life and society. And Bildung is the process by which a person undergoes personal cultivation and maturation by inculcating values and principles. So Ordnung is relatively easier to create: frameworks, rules, a list of things you have to check off. Whereas Bildung is more intrinsic, and it's an organic process of growing Bildung. So while any framework is an attempt to create Ordnung, how does one then encourage Bildung in the sense of encouraging mindsets to adopt the principles informing the framework and translate them into practice? Now, this is the challenge. So right now, in terms of my involvement in work on AI in Singapore, I'm part of the Artificial Intelligence Technical Committee that actually represents Singapore in terms of working towards the International Standards Organization sets of standards on a range of values for the use and the deployment of AI. And in particular, I think we're right now, my working group is focused on AI security, and that covers the whole, the process from creating the algorithms, what is the solution, what is the model you work with, what is the output. So we're actually looking at it from a root and branch, from a beginning to end sort of a perspective. And our challenge is looking for use cases right now. And as I mentioned earlier on, it's nascent. We are trying to see where we can kind of work with existing use cases to actually formulate something that is fairly concrete, that we can actually take and contribute towards the ISO's work on standards. So that is interesting because for those of us in the committee, and we're drawn from all over, from academia, from research, from think tanks, from business, from the government as well. And it's been a very interesting process. So in terms of our collaboration on these standards, if we're looking at broadly scope for collaboration, where we are trying to establish a baseline, this is to start with finding common ground from which, the parties' mutual desired outcomes for such collaboration may result. I think of my days as a transaction lawyer, and the first thing you do is you look for the common ground. You look for the common language, the common goals, the common desires that you want to kind of like achieve with the other party. And this is a range of, could be a range of mutual societal and economic goals, fostering innovation to benefit people, bolstering local AI and technical talent pool. I think, within the US and Singapore, we have that challenge. We're looking to adoption of smart city solutions. And common ground also arises in shared values and principles, which is what this panel is convened around to discuss. But I think what I want to sort of like say here is what is also vital is the mutual recognition of each other's strengths and also existing obligations to other collaboration partners and each other's national interests. And this is relevant in any collaboration or partnership involving public sector organizations, businesses, institutions engaged in higher education, research or development, or NGOs. So as far as I see it, Singapore actively pursues an agenda of multilateralism. Our Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong has consistently maintained the rules-based order and a cooperative approach is not an option, but a necessity for Singapore. And that multilateralism needs to be adapted for the world we live in today. And what a world we live in today, because 18 months ago, I don't think anyone of us would have imagined where we would be now. And it seems that where we are is a good opportunity to seriously look at how we use AI for addressing the problems we face today in terms of, the pandemic is one, but, climate change, so many issues. So for Singapore's part, small country, it's a small state, multilateralism and a rules-based order is critical because this creates responsibilities on all countries and promotes global stability. So with that, I'm happy to I'm done, and I'll hand this back to Crystal. And I look forward to the discussion and the questions that will follow. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Ms. Teo, for your in-depth discussion on Singapore's approach to AI and governance, specifically the Model AI Governance Framework, and some thoughts on US-Singaporean cooperation on AI standards and ethics, which hopefully we can get to more in this discussion and Q&A segment of the program. I'll now hand over the mic to Mark Manantan, Pacific Forum's resident Lloyd and Lillian Dacey Fellow, to moderate the Q&A and the discussion. Mark?
Thanks very much, Crystal. It's indeed a stellar panelists joining us this morning. And so I think before we jump into the question and answer, I'd like to recap some of the critical points that were raised by our speakers, starting off with Dr. Jacqueline Kerr, sharing her thoughts about the importance of the US-Singapore strategic partnership and where artificial intelligence is becoming a centerpiece of that partnership, AI, where the interdependencies of this that we build around this dual use technology. And as she mentioned, it's not just a dual use technology, it's a multi-use technology that we see its application in every realm of social, national, and economic interests. But also she spotlighted and also discussed about this very, I really got this term from her, interoperability of not just the technology, but also the values that supports it. And if we see now how AI is really changing the technological and social landscape with regards to the concerns and how much this technological disruption is AI is bringing to the fore, with various concerns about AI and ethics, about trade-offs with the norms, the maximum benefits, and also how do we mitigate worst case scenarios. And she narrated and gave examples about this massive unemployment if we are the second order effect of AI, if we aren't able to act on these issues, as well as bias of facial recognition technologies, as well as the opacity of decision key powers that these algorithms have. But also she pointed out about the role of the United States, particularly the Department of Defense, in crafting AI ethics, particularly by the National Commission on Artificial Intelligence. And she highlighted the intergovernmental or interagency cooperation amongst a lot of stakeholders within the US government, but also the private sector, and zeroed in on 5 principles that were put forward by the Department of Defense: the responsible use of AI, equitable use, traceability, reliability, or reliable use, and governability. Moving on to Professor Simon Chesterman, pushing the envelope further, he initially discussed or started his talk about how new technology is becoming a source of concern. He neatly laid out the various facets of AI on narrow AI, machine learning, robotics, and the relationship of these with artificial intelligence. And he discussed about the legal perspective or the regulatory challenges that AI is confronting at the very moment. How do we ensure that artificial intelligence is sustainable, it minimizes harms, and that we have the proper regulation? He identified 3 factors of challenges. We have speed, autonomy, and opacity. But also, I think it's very noteworthy to point out his observation that some of the ethical principles that we have now are quite overlapping, and about human control, transparency, safety, accountability, non-discrimination, and privacy. And he stressed that among all of these 6 principles, the most pressing issues lies with human control, how we preserve human centricity and explainability, and also transparency, where do we put the onus or the responsibility into account. And lastly, Professor Chesterman also highlighted this push and pull factor between regulation and innovation. And we see this now play out in the current context or climate of the US, China, and EU in terms of their regulation and approaches to innovation and artificial intelligence. And lastly, I think bringing humanity to artificial intelligence, we have our final speaker, Ms. Ling, highlighting AI for good. I think I'll use that term about how we could use AI in a manner that it enhances our existence, it's harmless and sensitive to our human values and principles. And she provided us with concrete and pragmatic approaches done by Singapore with its model AI governance framework, highlighting four pillars of the framework. The first one, the internal governance and structure and measures that are put in place for risk management. She also discussed about the role of human involvement in augmented decision-making. The third pillar, which is the operations management in terms of how we develop, select, and maintain AI models. And lastly, stakeholder interaction and communications. And then in closing off her discussion, she stressed that Singapore, as a very technologically advanced country in Southeast Asia, will continue to support multilateralism in put forwarding or developing further these universal principles that will underpin AI in the futures to come. And so I think we have 15 to 20 minutes left for questions. And I would just like to remind our audience or participants that you have 2 options for asking questions or making comments. First one is you can raise your hand in the webinar controls accessible from the participants tab. And the other is to open the question and answer window. To ask a question, you can type your question into the Q&A box and click send. You can also upvote someone else's question. If you raise your hand to ask your question verbally, the host will enable your microphone and ask you to unmute yourself. Please be ready to unmute yourself if you're called. If your question is directed to a particular speaker, please identify the speaker in your question. And so I think as we are waiting for more questions to come, I'd like to take this opportunity to ask the question. Just to tie in all the discussions that we have from the US perspective, the Singaporean perspective, and also perspectives about, Professor Chesterman discussed about the EU. If we consider, my question is, if we consider artificial intelligence as transnational and it crosses borders, how can we align our objectives as a region or in the perspective of US and Singapore to encourage more innovation in trustworthy AI despite the current competing climate? And so I'll open that question, I think, to the entire, to all the 3 speakers.
Well, I guess I can start to give those who spoke later the benefit of time. And also gives me an opportunity to thank them for their fantastic presentations. I guess one way to think about this is this isn't our first rodeo with one of these transnational digital tech issues. Of course, probably I could think of other examples, but having spent a lot of time studying internet governance and internet policy, that's one that comes to mind immediately as a transnational technological issue that raised new governance challenges because of its transnational scope and also created new value balance conflicts. If you look back a little over a decade ago, the US was promoting the internet freedom agenda when under Secretary Clinton in the State Department. And this, if you look back at it now, seems in some ways foresightful and in other ways quaint, because the emphasis at the time was on the extreme of freedom of expression, of freedom of data flows across borders, of and you think about this now from the perspective of the role of data and AI and the potential militarization, and you see things have gotten a lot more complex. Just on the internet, they've gotten more complex with different types of speech that challenge national security, like disinformation and extremism. And people who were on the same side on these issues back when it was sort of nascent now realize, well, there are actually several sides to these arguments. And I think the same is true and will continue to be true with AI and data and emerging related technologies, that it takes a while for us to really understand the full repercussions as the technology rolls out and develops and affects more sectors of the economy globally. But the key is to understand what the core values are we want to ensure. And so this is one place where the question of sort of trade-offs around regulation or not that Simon brought up is really critical, because sometimes you could regulate something or pass laws about it that wouldn't fully understand where things are going in terms of the repercussions 5-10 years down the road. And so in some cases, it might be the case that it's better to have norms and best practices and heavy focus on cooperation around those endpoint values you're trying to ensure than necessary strict regulatory guidelines. But you do need to have those norms and best practices and agreement on goals. And I mean, some of that has to do with democracy, right? It has to do with values that stand against authoritarianism and digital role of, or the role of digital technologies in human rights violations, or new types of encroachment on human dignity that we didn't foresee some decades ago. Some of the issues with privacy and autonomy raised here that just go further and deeper. And yet it also requires thinking about security. And sometimes these raise interesting trade-offs. And this is where, when I mentioned value trade-offs, it really is a matter, you could list out the values you want to ensure, but sometimes if you look at use cases, they're in conflict. And then you have to figure out how you balance them. And so maybe if you pass a law to ensure one of them first, without realizing how it might rub up against the other, you're going to find your hands tied later. I mean, I'm not going to take a stand on this here, but some people would say the US, because of our First Amendment protections, is in that position with regard to things like disinformation and extremism online when we try to work that balance. Whereas other countries have a freer hand in balancing between priorities there. But just think of examples like that with AI as well. I'll hand off to the next speaker.
Thanks for your insights, Jacqueline. And as I was listening to you, one word crept into my mind, and non-proliferation. I was thinking about post-Second World War, use of nuclear weapons, and what happened during the Cold War as well, and casting my mind back on the history. And it may be actually a little bit counterintuitive for me to talk about non-proliferation, but I've heard from the both of you about this is what we don't want it to be. But then at the same time, we want the ability to innovate. We want to grow our industries. We want to encourage talent. We want to develop our smart cities. We want to look for solutions for the problems we have today. But then we have dual use issues. Then we have, this issue, this is danger, or this grave risk of full autonomous AI. And my colleagues in RSIS who look at military transformation, they're fully on this, and they're like, oh, this is really bad. So non-proliferation, it may be a word that people are, may not want to hear, because they're like, why are you chilling innovation? But I look at it as, here is the space of, here is where you should not go. This is where we non-proliferate. This is where we do not go. But everything outside is fair game. So it's a glass half full sort of approach. And if states can agree, okay, this is what we do not use AI for. This is what we have to be open with each other, because we don't want the consequences that irresponsible use of AI will visit upon us. And given that we're so interconnected now, and someone you pointed out, speed and opacity, it's my reaction to that is seriously consider non-proliferation, because I think we can work that work with that for the best interests of everyone concerned.
Yeah, I mean, let me give 3 historical examples, and I completely agree with Yiling. My last one is going to be in that space, but a slight twist. So bad example is 2001, the US drew a red line on stem cell research. George W. Bush administration said, no, we're not going to do stem cell research, it's unethical. Singapore said, fantastic, we'll do stem cell research. Around the world, basically it meant that the US fell behind on stem cell research. So that's an example of innovation being restrained. Interesting example, so that's a national regulation that arguably didn't achieve its objective. Go back to the 1970s, recombinant DNA technology, so-called gene splicing, was innovative, and researchers themselves started getting worried about the possible implications if things got out of the laboratory. And so they went to Aslamar Conference Center and had a retreat and basically agreed on principles for containing potentially dangerous activities and prohibiting some others. The problem is, at the time in the 1970s, you could get most researchers under one roof at a conference center. Most of them worked at public institutions, and most of them were pretty confident that whatever they agreed to would be followed through with. Years later, there was an Aslamar AI principles meeting, but that was more aspirational. But that's an example of something that did broadly work. But actually, I agree with you, Ling. The best example is at least the hope of what came out of the Second World War, where nuclear energy, there was this enormous optimism about nuclear energy. There was the hope of electricity that would be too cheap to meter, that you could have applications in medicine, in agriculture. But there was this danger that a small problem, we could blow up the world. And so the grand bargain that was meant to be at the heart of the International Atomic Energy Agency was technology transfer. The countries with nuclear weapons would encourage the development of peaceful applications of nuclear technology in exchange for a commitment not to weaponize. And actually, I'm going to shame.
Thanks.
You're on mute.
Simon, I think you're on mute. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, a shameless plug. I put a chapter, is going to be freely available online, basically suggesting that you could have this grand bargain of technology transfer. Now, it didn't entirely work in the context of nuclear energy, but today it would be kind of pleasantly shocking, I think, to the theorists working in the 1940s and 50s that so few countries have nuclear weapons and that they haven't been used in anger since 1945. So that is one interesting model.
Right. So thank you so much. I think staying on this conversation about how do we avoid AI for bad and make it AI for good. And I'll be throwing in 3 questions, and I'd like the members of the panel to answer if you're keen to answer. And the first question is, how do we deal, this is from Dr. Jim Corcoran of Hawaii Pacific University, how do we deal with those entities which do not engage in the use of ethical standards in artificial intelligence? The second question is from Jasmine Crawford Hill. She asks, Many states are still yet to come to a formal position on the use of increasingly autonomous systems in military applications and how this sits with their obligations under laws of armed conflict. What does this mean for interoperability, where allies may have differing positions on the acceptability of use of AI-enabled systems such as lethal autonomous weapons, etc.? The third one would be, how could demographic constraints posed by an aging population lead states like Singapore to integrate and rely on artificial intelligence for national security and defense? Would these states be more likely to push for more flexible limits on the ethical use of killer robots? Again, I remind the panel to answer questions that you're comfortable with, and may we start with Jacqueline?
Sure. Okay. So on the first one, how to deal with unethical uses and prevent them and yet get the benefits from ethical uses. Well, I think one piece which is important here is also how do we cooperate with our adversaries? So we've talked a little bit about what the ethical constraints are that we should agree to, what the processes are, different models of governance or of efforts to build those norms and ethical rules. The Aslamar example is fantastic. But of course, one of the challenges here is, what if you're sitting across the table from an adversary or from a state or other actor that doesn't share those values in some way and isn't going to come to the table on them, or that doesn't share some of your key values at least? And, you know, I mentioned democracy in my previous comments, but I think it's also important not to make that the only thing we focus on here, because we need to be able to engage with states that aren't necessarily democracies, or where there's debate about their contested status as democracies, and still find that core kernel of something to cooperate around. And, you know, it comes down sometimes to the existential threat. We certainly managed this in many ways during the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. And I think that it requires building trust with actors in those other countries in various ways. It also might require various sorts of verification procedures. Now, this is challenging if you're not going to have firm rules, but maybe there are some things you can try to reach cooperative agreements on that are very narrow. One of the things, for example, that's been discussed has to do with use of automated AI response. Of automated response for nuclear attack. This, of course, you know, the man not in the loop sort of response. Of course, there are Cold War scenarios that have played out. If there hadn't been a man in the loop, then we'd all been dead. And so it doesn't take that great a leap of imagination to think what could go wrong with what we think is the best technology of the day. But I think that thinking that through and thinking through what the repercussions are for the systems we already have, like nuclear weapons, that have that sort of existential threat potential is really critical for that first point, as well as the sort of whole of society and with all partners efforts to build norms and ethical standards. In terms of the autonomous systems, I guess I sort of made these two go together, but the second question was on interoperability. What does it mean for allies? Oh, okay, yes, where allies have different positions with regard to autonomous systems. Well, I think that's a really good question, and I'm not sure that I know the immediate solution to it, but I think that it is one of the reasons that discussing these value issues is so critical amongst allies and partners, especially that cooperate in national security contexts and military contexts. As far as the question about demographics and demographic constraints, I'm not sure I fully caught what the question was driving at. I didn't see where that one.
Yeah, it's about how could demographic constraints, this is by Bailey Raya, how could demographic constraints posed by an aging population lead states like Singapore to integrate and rely on AI for national security and defense? Would these states be more likely to push for more flexible limits on the ethical use of killer robots?
It's sort of the question of, is this something we can use to replace manpower if you're a small state? And I mean, of course, we've crossed this bridge before in other ways. Think of nuclear weapons or other major military technological advances in history that have empowered small states that don't necessarily have a lot of manpower. And I think here we really need to think about, again, how do we ensure that we're on the same page across allies and partners, and have those conversations also with potential adversaries. And I'm not sure that there's a silver bullet solution to prevent actors from taking that approach, or the killer drones, or drone swarms, or all the other possibilities that have been floated. But the more we talk about it in cooperative context and confidence building context, the better. And I think with this one, it also might be a time to flag the importance of scientific collaboration and scientific diplomacy as well. I spent 3 years at Lawrence Livermore National Lab, and one of the things that I learned about while I was there was the history of the lab-to-lab diplomatic efforts and the role that they had played between scientists who had been working on opposite sides during the Cold War. And I think sometimes you can leverage that transnational collaborative potential in the scientific community to build trust and standards as well. Over.
Thanks, Jacqueline. I think I'll pick up on what on some of the things you mentioned, and I cannot agree more with keeping the conversation open, keeping doors open. The comment I made about non-proliferation is, if people get on board, the more people get on board something, the ones who are not on board may be pressured to actually reconsider their position. Because if you present this hypothesis as this is beneficial to everyone, don't you want to be part of this conversation? That is actually persuasion, as opposed to sanctioning, which is really a very much a last resort. And something else you said about looking for other venues of cooperation. I'm thinking of what goes on in the ISS and the International Space Station. You've got astronauts, you've got cosmonauts from all over the world, from ostensibly large countries which are seemingly at odds with each other, but they're all up there. They're working together. And exactly, that thing you said about scientific diplomacy, even cultural diplomacy as well. This is an ongoing conversation, and I don't believe that any state will shut itself out of a national conversation, because if anything that has been taught to us in the last 18 months in this pandemic, that we are so inextricably linked to each other. And there's a system failure in one part of our network, it dominoes across. From this really so little room for isolationism now, especially now. And what a small state like Singapore is going to do in terms of our aging population, declining birth rate, what we're going to do about national defense. The idea is not to go to war. As far as I see it, war is bad, but at the same time, you've got to keep your powder dry. So, and you have to kind of like fight an intelligent war. And I've said this: you can't fight the last war. And I think, Jacqueline, you might understand that sentiment, that you really need to look at the landscape now and see how are you going to best deploy your capacities. What kind of like arsenal you're going to have ready. And war really should be a last resort. And it's not how do you fight your best war. I don't think that's a conversation anymore, because I don't think that's what most countries in the world want.
So maybe picking up from where Yiling left off, and just the pandemic, I think, is fascinating. I mean, we'll be studying the pandemic for decades, but you're right that we're all in the same boat, and it is extraordinary that for the last year and a half, we've had basically one conversation. We've had scientists around the world cooperating to an unprecedented degree to try and address one problem, and so we're all in the same boat. And yet at the same time, it's everyone for themselves. We raise the drawbridges, we close our borders, we have this scramble for vaccines. It's incredibly inequitable how vaccines are going to be distributed around the world. So I think you see those two things at the same time.
Yeah.
But on this question of regulating AI, maybe I can sort of take a step back and sort of, again, maybe this is the academic asking not how do we regulate, but why? Why are we trying to regulate? And I break this into three areas that I think will touch on some of the questions. And often regulation really is just about managing risks. So back to autonomous vehicles, for example, what we really want is for the cars to be safe or the buses to be safe. And you regulate in order to minimize harm. But I don't think most of us think, I mean, trolley problems aside, and I think great that we've got through an hour of this without anyone talking about the trolley problem, but most of us don't have major ethical concerns about the idea of autonomous vehicles. Lethal autonomous weapons, however, do raise major ethical concerns. What's interesting is that often people say, oh, they're not safe, they're dangerous, when in fact, there's a pretty good argument that lethal autonomous weapons might be safer, might be more compliant with the laws of war than humans, because many war crimes occur because soldiers are fatigued, they're angry, they're racist or whatever, they're badly trained. And so all of this is stuff that the machines are meant to be better at. The reason we're concerned about lethal autonomous weapons at base, I don't think is really a safety concern. I mean, Terminator-style scenarios aside, what we're really concerned with, and this came up before, is this idea that in a life and death decision, a human should have to grapple with it, and a human should be held accountable for it. And that's why the legal response is likely to be in one of two scenarios. It's either that the deployment of certain weapons could itself be a war crime. If you deploy a weapon that is uncontainable, uncontrollable, that arguably is in itself a war crime. And that case has been made long ago about things like chemical weapons, about even cluster munitions. Or you would just have command responsibility, that if the commander deploys something, he or she is going to be responsible. And there are interesting debates over the laws of war there. So I do think this question of why we want to regulate should shape the question of how we regulate. And then just the third way in which I think sometimes the lens of regulation is best understood is a kind of process legitimacy, that if there are some risks we want to minimize and some wrongs we just want to avoid by drawing red lines, there are also some processes that we just want to be followed because the legitimacy of certain processes is tied in with the way in which those decisions are made. For example, public sector decisions. A government that determines how to allocate goods, a judge who determines how a particular case is resolved. The rightness or wrongness of the decision is less important in many ways than the identifiability of the decision maker and the ability to hold him or her accountable through some kind of democratic process, back to Jacqueline's point about democracy, or at least public legitimacy.
Thank you so much for those responses. I think just in the interest of time, I'll be asking again 3 questions, and you may pick one question just to so we could cover all of them. This question is concerns about problems with AI and combining questions. We have Richard Mack from the US SynPac. AI has a long way to go before it will achieve its full value. The human is able to simulate the entire surrounding environment and make decisions based on that panoramic and all-source intelligence. Driverless autos have not met safety standards, as many incidents have shown. So how do we intelligently introduce AI into our relationship with Singapore? Second question is a big problem. I think this is with cybersecurity. A big problem with cybersecurity is the problem of attribution. It may be very hard to identify the perpetrators of cyber attacks. Is there a similar problem with attribution as a problem with artificial intelligence? If AI causes damage or harm and it's hard to identify who is responsible for causing the damage, how do we solve this problem of attribution and accountability? I think this question pertains to adversarial AI, how this adversarial AI could work with in terms of cybersecurity. And I think the last question would be, what are the next concrete steps for the US and Singapore to cooperate in the realm of AI? So again, you may pick on one question or two and address them very briefly. You don't have to address them all. Jacqueline? First question.
Sure. Okay, so I think that I'll focus on the cybersecurity question, or the question of attribution. So yes, there likely are similar attribution challenges as there are with cybersecurity. We've gotten a lot better at a nation state level at attribution, but then there are still challenges of attribution on a legal or a publicly legitimate level, public messaging, or also who will participate in an attribution. Like if something is discovered to be a state attack by one other state, if the state that is their arch rival comes out and says this was you and doesn't provide any evidence, nobody is likely to believe that who is inclined to believe the first state. But if 10 states come out and say, we all saw evidence that this was that state, and here's some of the evidence, then that's much more forceful. But then there's a question of what evidence can you provide publicly without showing your hand in terms of your own sort of surveillance capabilities, sources and methods, things like this. And I assume that with AI capabilities, especially when they're intertwined sometimes with cyber capabilities, we'll see some of the same. But I think there's another layer to it as well, which gets at this question of who is to be held accountable. And this is where you don't have the ability to say why a decision was made the way it was. It's a black box unless it's explainable AI, which is a work in process. Then, do you hold the algorithm accountable, or do you hold who used it accountable? And how do you know who used it? And so I think you get back to some of the questions that Simon was getting at about the legal and legitimacy challenges posed by AI. And those are layered on top of the attribution challenges of knowing where this digital technology that's coming at you comes from, who actually launched it. And so it sort of challenges layered upon challenges. And I think that there are various solutions that get us part of the way, like what I talked about with cyber attribution. And with AI, we'll likely see a similar development, but that still won't solve the problem completely of who is to be held accountable. And that will be the next layer of the challenge.
Anyone, Ling or Simon?
Sure, I can go next.
Simon, go ahead. My brain is still churning.
So some years ago, Donald Rumsfeld, when he was Secretary of Defense, came to Singapore and gave a presentation. This was during the Iraq War in 2003. And he was asked a series of very awkward questions. And he said, the questions I want to answer, I will answer. Questions I don't want to answer, I will respond to. So I fear this might be a response to the questions. But just to because it ties together some of the regulatory gaps we've been talking about. But I tend to think we need to look at different sort of levels of possible regulation. And back to the very fundamental question, how do you avoid many of these things happening? The reason why most laws, by most ethical principles are complied with is self-restraint. And so I think this conversation needs to permeate to the level of developers, and that's actually one of the real challenges, because unlike biological weapons, nuclear weapons, and so on, the threshold of entry into AI is very low. So the technology is quite easy. Cybersecurity is a good example. You can plug and play materials from around the world and then cause enormous harm. But some level of self-regulation at the level of industry is going to be key. It's going to be key, but it's not going to be enough. Because I don't think it's fair, I don't think it's realistic to rely on developers to just hold back from doing bad things. I think there are some red lines that we need to police, and that's going to require states. It's going to require governments to establish clear rules, what you can and can't do. And on things like attribution, you shouldn't be allowed to produce a computer system that is going to be uncontrollable or uncontainable. There are computer viruses that get deployed into the wild that then proliferate. If that becomes an intelligent system that's proliferating itself, then there are real dangers. So I think we do need governments. But then there is this additional layer that governments themselves can't be relied on all to do the right thing. And you have the danger of this sort of lowest common denominator approach, the governments that don't want to constrain innovation and so will either sort of allow themselves to be flags of convenience, as we see in maritime law, or have very low standards, or even, as in the case of North Korea, actively use cyber hacking as a means of generating revenue. So I do think there needs to be some level of international coordination And so in that article that I posted, I sort of somewhat optimistically proposed the idea of an international artificial intelligence agency modeled on the idea of the International Atomic Energy Agency. And I mean, in my most optimistic moments, I think there is a possibility that countries with technology could share that technology with others in exchange for a commitment that the technology only be used for good. But even I accept that that's maybe a little bit optimistic. But that I think would be a way of trying to encourage the better angels of our nature to get and share the advantages of technologies like AI while trying to minimize the harms.
I'll just jump in quickly and say, I concur with Jacqueline and Simon. This is a tricky thing, and attribution is a tricky thing. Singapore takes the position that we don't actually attribute directly for many reasons. And I think this everything it has need to be responded to. I'm going to use Simon's term. I think has been responded to adequately. So thank you very much.
Yeah. So again, in the interest of time, my apologies to all the participants who have sent in their questions. We really appreciate your active participation. And I turn back the proverbial microphone to Dr. Crystal Pryor.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you so much to our speakers and participants for taking the time to join us today. It was really an informative and engaging discussion from the perspectives of our two countries. So this marks the culmination of the US-Singapore Cyber and Tech Security Virtual Series. We've run it over the past 7 months. We would really like to extend our sincere gratitude to the US Embassy in Singapore for sponsoring this forward-looking initiative. Also, special thanks to all the participants who've been engaged with us over the past 7 months, really throughout this entire series. We'll share the post-event survey link again in the chat box now. We would really appreciate it if you would take a few minutes to complete the survey and share your feedback. Although this is the final session for the US-Singapore Cyber and Tech Security Virtual Series, we're happy to announce we'll be back in the fall to kick off the US-Singapore Tech and Innovation Virtual Dialogue, which will tackle how the US and Singapore can continue to spark and reinforce technological innovation in exciting areas such as digital connectivity, green technology, and financial inclusion across the region. This initiative is once again generously supported by the US Embassy in Singapore. I should note that the Pacific Forum has been concurrently hosting a separate US-Singapore Indo-Pacific Conversation series, also with support from the US Embassy Singapore, in which senior experts review key milestones in the relationship, discuss evolving challenges, and explore strategic imperatives and innovative policy prescriptions for further advancing the US-Singapore partnership. The final US-Singapore Indo-Pacific Conversation Series session, Next Generation Voices in US-Singapore Relations, will be happening on July 12th US time or July 13th Asia time, and will feature members of our US-Singapore Next Generation Leaders cohort presenting on the research papers they wrote. Please do mark your calendars for July 12th US or July 13th, and stay tuned for more details. On that note, we hope you will continue staying engaged with Pacific Forum programming, which you can find out about more on our website, www.pacforum.org. So visit our website, like our Facebook page, follow us on Twitter to receive updates for the Tech and Innovation Virtual Dialogue in the coming months, as well as Pacific Forum programming activities. Big thanks again to our panelists for joining us today, and to the US Embassy Singapore for making this really exciting series and the next one possible. We hope we'll see you all at our next events. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks
Thank you.
so much, everyone.
Thanks very much.